Brilliant. Thank you so much, Michael. So I'd like to say we are very, very delighted to have Assistant Professor Zawati here today of McGill University. So he's joining us on our first webinar of our Digital Technologies and AI Healthcare series. So a bit of background about Man. He is a lawyer and is based at the Faculty of Medicine. He's also the Executive Director of the Centre of Genomics and Policy in the Department of Human Genetics at McGill. Man works at an interdisciplinary level, so within the clinical and healthcare domain, and his research focuses on the ethical, legal and policy aspects of biobanking, data sharing, and the use of novel technologies such as mHealth apps, which is what his much anticipated talk is about today. So as well as being a very well-published researcher in major journals such as Nature Reviews Genetics, among others, Man is no stranger to Oxford, having received the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Scholarship to study here. But what I'd like to say is more recently, his research has investigated the legal and ethical issues in translating digital technologies and research data platforms into biomedical practice. And one of the cross-cutting themes he works on is understanding the legal duties of healthcare professionals and responsible persons in using these technologies. So you can find out more about his projects. The main ones that he has been working on are the AUDACE, the Gen Council, and the Omics for Precision Medicine. You can also have a chat with him afterwards to find out more about these things. But without further ado, I would like to invite Assistant Professor Zawati to begin his talk today, titled, "Will an app a day keep the doctor away? The ethical, legal issues surrounding mHealth apps from a Canadian perspective." So thank you, Man.
Thank you very much, Nisha, for this kind of introduction. Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing well. One of the fun things about doing presentations like this one is finding really cool titles as much as you can with the word app. I mean, will an app a day keep the doctor away? Other choices were like WhatsApp Doc or some like it app, or anyway, so we decided to go with this one for today. And of course, I'll be focusing on mHealth apps more specifically and giving you a brief introduction on our Canadian perspective and our research in that realm. So I'm going to start with a bit of context. I think it's really important for us to understand where we are and where this is coming from and why this is an important topic. And then I'll be talking a little bit about these mHealth apps while keeping in mind the general move squeezing out the doctor from the clinic and these technologies playing a bigger role. And I'll say a few words about their immersion in the world of research as well, and I'll conclude with some remarks. So probably many of you have seen this cover. Really kind of focuses on the world of genomics and the personal genome age, but I think it also sends a very striking and interesting message, which is the more information you have, the more you are in control of yourself and you have your life in your hands, which is a message that, of course, has a backslide to it. And it's a message that is also heavily presented and shared with companies such as Apple, where they talk about their new platforms that we'll talk about a little bit later today, ResearchKit and CareKit, that it's empowering medical researchers, doctors, and now you, as in you, the patient, or you, the consumer. But as I said, there's always another side to all of this, and I couldn't find, a more striking example of this. So I looked for our Canadian ambassador in Hollywood, Ryan Reynolds, to help us with that. And so basically he said, I can go from researching a cramp on WebMD to coffin shopping in under 90 seconds. And I think this message is, pretty much about the lack of capacity of many of us to discriminate in terms of the information that we have and that we receive in order to make decisions. But there's another aspect to it all, which is data and how important it is. And this is a an illustration from The Economist back in 2017, talking about the value in the data and that it's become a valuable resource. Just to give you an example, when we talk about mergers and acquisitions of very large companies around the world, usually before setting a price, there's of course many factors, including how many stations there is around the world, how many continents does it span, how many hundreds, maybe thousands of workers and employees, and then we put a price on it. WhatsApp, which is an app and one that was bought by Facebook back in 2014, I think at the time had a very small group of people working for it, but it did say that it had around 400 million subscribers. And for a very small company, in terms of size, it was bought by Facebook for $19.4 billion back in 2014. And this is really because of the data that it had and its importance. There are some studies as well, that talk about our relationship with our smartphones, our relationship with the mobile world, and our relationship with smart tech, where people are becoming more and more impatient in terms of the information that they want and that they gather, and also looking at the consumer's attention span going down from 12 seconds in 2000 to 8 seconds in 2015. And this is a research that was done by Microsoft back in 2015. I think is also important to keep in mind, especially when we think of situations like when we download an app and we start putting in personal information. There is sometimes a mention of an agreement, sometimes a mention of a privacy policy. How many of us actually take the time to go through these and make informed decisions related to our involvement? And the fact that we're becoming more and more impatient and less attention span, I think, doesn't necessarily help in this regard. There's a new book that came out earlier this year that I found very interesting, called Stolen Focus by Johan Hari, and discusses, why us individuals perhaps can't pay attention and how our focus has somewhat has diminished. Talking about the fact that, for many of us, using smart technology and smartphones, we're constantly, on those technologies, and some people are, might not be able to finish 2 chapters in a book, and they become exhausted, and the fact that we have exhausted, as he says, the attention resources that we have because of these, this flux of information. But also the other thing that he describes and he discusses in his book, which I found very interesting, is the monetization of the data that is currently being shared from consumers to different platforms. And basically, I had that idea as well, that through ads they're able to monetize, but it's actually more than that. When someone signs in a new application, a small them is created. That small them has no face, no discernible characteristics, no eyes, no nose, nothing. But the more we are on the app and the more we make choices, this small you becomes a little bit more like you. And these smaller yous are then targeted with ads and information. And so this information itself, this creation of a small you, is extremely valuable. I talk to my colleagues about it, and they say, well, I'm on Netflix and I'm still being recommended very bad movies, and so I'm not sure this works. My response to them is, well, your decision not to watch something is as valuable as your decision to watch something, and it's still information that's being shared. So keeping that into context, I think, is very interesting. Just taking a look at some numbers, in now North and South America, we have more than 1 billion mobile connections for a population that's less than 1 billion. So we're more recorded mobile connections than there are inhabitants. In Canada, 88% of Canadians own a smartphone. When we look at health-related apps more specifically, so these are ones that we call mHealth apps. Back in 2018, we were talking about approximately 325,000. I think this number, I wouldn't say has doubled, but clearly has expanded over the past 2 years since the pandemic and the creation of so many apps to palliate the fact that people were not able to either see doctors or go to the hospitals with remote care being offered. So these numbers are certainly today much higher than they were back in 2018. And the sector itself is expected to grow by close to 20% per year between 2021 and 2028. Into 2025, the overall digital health market is expected to exceed $500 billion in revenue. So this is expanding, this is big. And so it's important for us to kind of contextualize that, use that, and try to understand a little bit more what it means for us from an ethical and legal point of view. So again, from The Economist back in 2012, they're talking about squeezing out the doctor, and they said, well, there's this phenomenon that's going on, and either because of lack of resources or because new technology is slowly but surely integrating within the clinic, we will see other professionals acquiring reserved acts that were normally acts that the physician was able to do. And this is with the creation of new professions or with the expansion of already existing professions, and also the integration of technology in the clinic. And mHealth apps are part of that, sort of phenomenon that's happening. Back in the days when we started discussing mHealth apps, when we started discussing AI, Montreal, or the city where McGill has presented itself as really kind of a hub for AI in the future. And there's a lot of companies that were looking into expanding their business relating to that. And that information struck me when I was looking at it. This is a company that wanted to leverage technology, data science, and machine learning, and so created this platform called Mind.me, which is a passive application that, once installed on a mobile device, requires no input or effort from the user. And Mind.me ambiently monitors behavior and follows a set it and forget it approach. When Mind.me detects the early symptoms of depression, notifications will be sent to the user's predetermined circle of care. So, of course, a lot of questions here about how this happens, what kind of information is shared, what's the privacy policy, details when it comes to this type of information, and what are we going to use? Early detection of early symptoms of depression. Is it the voice? So is it listening to my voice and how it changes? Is it because I keep sending sighs in my emails to my colleagues? What is that exactly? Another interesting sort of situation here is the FEM app. That's used in the US, EU, and Africa. Basically, it's an app that was funded by anti-abortion campaigners and sowed doubt over the safety of birth control. And this was an investigation from The Guardian. So again, issues of trust, issues of information. These are all important aspects that we need to keep in mind when we look at this. And I think this kind of led to a movement of, a very important discussion around regulation, around governance, more specifically of these applications. Some of the issues that we have here is, even if downloads and smartphone applications are declining, health applications usage has increased, and especially for millennials, and they do not undergo a rigorous evaluation. Because this is a rapidly developing and changing technology, and there isn't really something that's out there that allows it to happen in a timely fashion. And so regulatory agencies find themselves in a situation where they might not be able to completely have control over this. In Canada, at the end of 2019, we came up with a guidance document from Health Canada called Software as a Medical Device, and described, the ability to regulate some of these applications. But again, it kind of used a little bit the US way of dealing with it, which is prioritizing it by levels of risk, which is totally understandable. There's a difference between an app that, kind of tells me, gives me information about potential symptoms and conditions versus one that regulates the level of insulin in my body. One of them actually has direct physical, impact that needs to be well regulated. But nonetheless, the others also have certain risks associated with them, including privacy, including, the data sharing and so on, that would probably require a little bit more scrutiny. And in the United States, what we're seeing is also a move from professional associations to have a role, not just, at a governmental level, but also from a professional association level, to get involved in these. And we do have something like that, but it's only limited to apps that are recommended to a patient by a physician. It kind of removes the big boom of applications that have been created over the past 6-7 years that actually, in their function would not require necessarily a role by the physician. Even though it says that it does not substitute for a doctor, and we'll see that in a moment, but still is an app that's used without the specific recommendation of a doctor, and sometimes are used so that people don't need to go to see a doctor. So there is a gap in this, and it's a very important one that I think we need to look into a little bit more. This is from a 2019 study where they looked at apps in a couple of countries, and they said that, it's the data sharing practices themselves are not very transparent. Much of the shared user data is unique and identifying, and several apps shared sensitive data, such as a list of medications or precise location. So, there is a discussion around, at a minimum, that users should be able to choose precisely which types of data and have the option to opt out, which is certainly not the case in many applications where you opt out for all or nothing. And it's a bit of a problem for actual control, because remember the message at the beginning was your life, is in your hands and you have control over it. But when it comes to actually these decisions, you might not necessarily have full control of all the different aspects. And clinicians should be also cautious about the choices they make. And when they recommend apps to consumers, they need to explain the potential for loss of personal privacy as part of informed consent. So there is a movement with regards to that. There has been some studies here in Canada, not about mHealth, apps specifically, but there is a segment of it that looks more clearly for mHealth apps, and they showed that the majority, 66% of Canadian adults regularly monitor one or more elements of their health, such as weight, blood sugar, blood pressure. And about 40% of Canadians are connected trackers. That is, they use smartphone applications or mobile devices to track their personal health data. So in order for us to be able to kind of better understand this landscape, we decided to try out a classification of this technology in a paper that we wrote a few years ago. And we've divided it mainly into 4 different categories. The first category is general health and wellness information applications. The second one is illness prevention and management applications. The third one is tracking, logging, and trending applications. And the final one, which was a little bit more problematic, is the association applications, or what we call also commonly as symptom checkers. And one of the reasons why we did this is that we would really try to look at their capacity to actually propose a diagnosis. And in many of them, the diagnosis was technically possible, but in association applications, the diagnosis was very probable. And that also created some issues from a legal standpoint, because there isn't necessarily a doctor at the other end. Some of these applications actually do not have any clinicians at the other end, and some of them are actually in a different jurisdiction as well. So again, we looked at, here in Canada, among Canadians who use mobile applications for health surveillance, only 35% report that they share data with others. Of these, 61 reported sharing data with family members. Of course, these are a bit cumulative. 50% with friends, 34% with their doctor, and 20% with other users of the application. So again, if this is information that has diagnostic value, it's not necessarily shared with the doctor. As you can see, the doctors are at the end of the priority list here of stakeholders that receive such data. So I decided to try it for myself. And again, a disclaimer before talking about this disclaimer. This is probably a previous version of this application, but I've tried it more recently, and in terms of what I'm going to show you, there isn't really much of a change, but just to tell you that this is a previous, kind of shaping of this application. So the disclaimer remains the same. This app provides useful information, but is not a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you think you have a medical emergency, immediately call your doctor or dial 911. And so basically they're telling you, we're just providing you with the information. You do the rest. So I had to enter my age, of course, 25. So I put that there. It asked me for my gender, and then I chose symptom checker, and then I had to put symptoms. So I decided to go with burping and farsighted. I mean, the types of symptoms that are actually out there are interesting, to say the least. Some of them include ginger hair as a symptom for some reason. In any case, I won't go into those details, but I put burping and farsightedness. If you can see it closer to the bottom of the screen, the results here are fair in terms of the strength. The more you put symptoms, the more the result increases in terms of its strength. Unfortunately, what I found is sometimes you can put, contradicting symptoms. Apparently, small head is a symptom and big head is a symptom. So if you put those two, it doesn't cancel each other. But anyways, so we do that, and then there's more information. If you put in more information about your current medications or past or current conditions, the results become a little bit more strong. So I was interested to know, what was the condition here, and retinal detachment came in as one of the possibilities. And this is the information that you get. A retinal detachment is a medical emergency that can lead to vision loss or blindness if not treated within 24 hours of your first symptoms. Seek medical attention right away. If you can't drive, call 911. What I was surprised by is how they thought that I was able to read this with a retinal detachment. But in any case, just to say that we've read it. You can see here the kind of messaging that there's out there. It's if you go back to the, it's 2 dots out of 4, which is kind of almost fair in terms of the strength. There wasn't anything that was stronger than that. Gas was a possibility as well, but they were not higher than retinal detachment. So we've also evolved in the application world, and machine learning has started to slowly but surely get integrated. This is a play on Planet of the Apps and 2001 Space Odyssey of evolution. So Ada is a good example of this. So this is the type of information that you have to look into. And of course, there are terms and conditions and a privacy policy. You can also see a summary of those if you want. But, as a lawyer, you need to go in and read a little bit more about what's in there. And again, it's basically the same type of messaging that it does not make any medical diagnoses. You have to seek the advice of a professional if you're concerned about your health, and so on and so forth. You can also, ask that they contact you for opportunities to participate in a clinical research project, which is an interesting, kind of option there as well, allowing for research participation, which is something that mobile health apps are slowly but surely integrating themselves in. And this is basically the message. It gets smarter the more you tell me. So even before I started or had to put information about my symptoms or what I had, there were a couple of questions that were asked of me, and basically creating kind of a baseline, or for who I was. And then we started the assessment. I chose something a little bit more serious here, but headache. And now the questions started. And what I found really interesting is that sometimes I would answer the questions in a very arbitrary way. If their algorithm, felt that there was something here that wasn't really clear, I would actually get more questions. And so the more straightforward I was in my answers, the lesser the questions were. And so you had, a couple of, I just put here a few examples of the kind of questions that I got. And then after that, I'm getting a report that outlines possible causes for your symptoms. Of course, they're not going to use this as your diagnosis, right? It's a possible causes for your symptoms. And again, reminding me this is not a medical diagnosis. And if in doubt, I'd better seek advice from a medical professional. So that was the number one, that was one of the highest, which is I had a migraine. And basically it's because 9 of 10 people with these symptoms had this condition. But there's also less likely causes, right? And one of them is a brain tumor. And I could, of course, read more about this and look into it, but it is also part of the choices. I thought it was interesting to see, again, this is not an empirical research, and, it's just out of interest to see how people actually reacted to the use of these applications. This is in French, but it basically says, this is such a wonderful idea to, avoid long waiting lines in the clinic. We really needed this. The questions asked about the symptoms make sense, as if a real doctor is asking you, not just some random questions, gives you multiple results with ratings. Thank you. This is a great way to get some medical advice without having to wait in line for 2 hours to get it. This app can really reduce my trip to the doctor's office. And my personal favorite, it's like if Siri went to med school, fast and easy to use. And again, remember what the terms of, the terms of agreements and the privacy policy reminded us constantly, including the doctor, that this is not a medical diagnosis, but this is how people are actually using it. Again, take this with a grain of salt. This is, not a empirical study, but just a few examples from the results that we see and the comments that are made. It would be interesting to know how this would work in a court system here in Canada and in the province of Quebec, more specifically, where we've done our study. We don't have any case law on this particular issue, but there are some interesting case law that discusses disclaimers and the use of disclaimers for individuals who are not physicians when they provide information. And this case that I'm going to talk to you about was a case that the Appeal Court of Quebec, which is the highest court in the province of Quebec, just below the Supreme Court of Canada. They tried to appeal it and it was dismissed. But what basically the case was that you had a situation where there was an individual who had a health center and had a disclaimer as part of the intervention that they were doing, where they said, please be advised that this visit in no way represents a diagnosis and or treatment. Only your medical doctor can do so. And this is very similar to the kind of disclaimers that you would find in these applications. So what the court said basically is, we don't have a legal definition of diagnosis, at least in the law, in a legislation. But in order for us to protect the public, we will take the largest and most broad definition of diagnosis. So we're going to use the dictionary for it. And what the dictionary says is that it's an identification of a condition based on the symptoms. Anything that is identification of a condition by its symptoms is a diagnosis. And if you're not legally allowed to do a diagnosis, then you're illegally practicing medicine. And this was really interesting because, it could, if you would take this interpretation literally, a lot of these applications, would not be able to work in the province. But again, it comes back to the same issue at the beginning, that they're not regulated because they're not high risk necessarily, but they do provide information. And, even though this is not, stringent qualitative or quantitative analysis, but you just look at some of the comments made by people and you can see how it's being used, which is totally contrary to what it was supposed to. I'm also interested in looking at it from a genetics and genomics world as well. And there was a study that was made about the different apps that are there in the field of genetics and genomics. Almost 95% of these apps are used for references or referencing, but some of them are used for clinical tools, and some of them actually provide genetic test results. Some of the studies done on that show that approximately 1/4 of the apps had protective features like password protection, and some apps had a social network function, allowing users to share messages on Facebook, Twitter, or an app community. Again, very interesting. We're currently studying mobile health apps or crowdsourcing apps in the field of genomics as part of a collaboration between Quebec and Belgium in a recently funded project. And we started looking at some of the applications that are out there. This is an interesting one called Weather My Way, and it's designed for iPads. So this works with a DNA data from all genetic tests. So if you have done a genetic test, you can integrate it there, and it will provide you with, with information about how to deal with weather, everyday weather. And this is some of the results that comes out of this application. On the right-hand side, you have, if you were in San Francisco, and on the left-hand side, if you were in New York. So based on their analysis of your genetic information, in New York, you would have been told on that particular day that to slow down the aging process of your skin, apply moisturizer with SPF of at least 30 before going outside today. This is because it's a very sunny day. And in San Francisco, there's good news. It's partly cloudy. Your genes are keeping you healthy during this cloudy weather. You have just transferred your genetic data into this application, and now they have a copy of this genetic data with the capacity to do a lot with it for you to be able to know whether or not you should apply, moisturizer with SPF of at least 30 or not. And if you look, more carefully, you'll find that they don't have a developer, a privacy policy, and some of the information about sharing of personal information is very broad. This is also a field that is slowly but surely integrating within the research world as well. It really allows a lot of research projects to be able to actually recruit participants, although there is sometimes a quick kind of loss of participants, but it's still a very interesting and very useful tool for recruitment. There are research apps that strictly use data collected by itself, but there are research apps that integrate data from external sources within the actual smartphone or the iPad that you're using. This is an example from of a research study called MyGeneRank. But here, if you look at the documentation, you'll see a bit of a contradiction, right? So the information and genetic data provided by you will be used for study purposes only. We will not share your genetic data. And then on the right-hand side, the genetic and health information may be shared with other researchers for future research. So what is it? Is it shared or is it not shared, right? It's really, really important to look more carefully at these privacy policies. And it's also important when you look at consent process as well to, if you were a body that adjudicates, because right now, this is the process, at least with Apple, in 2015, they've changed their developers agreement to make sure that anybody who puts anything on their platform for research purposes, has a REB or an IRB approval. So if you're reviewing these, make sure that not only the written consent that you receive is reviewed, but also the text that's presented to the participants. And just being user-friendly in itself is not a justification for being vague or not providing enough information. There needs to be consistency between all these texts. It's also a very difficult process, but it requires certain expertise that maybe some IRBs don't currently have, but they should also be thinking about in the future, where they assess the level of identifiability. If there's coded information, who has the key? Will it be the researchers? Is it just the IT team? Is it the sponsors? Also depending on what is requested, how well is the curation system or the curation efforts are, how well are they thought of and presented and clarified. If you're asked to take pictures of moles in your body, and you explain that you are de-identifying this information, what does that actually mean? Especially if it's in the face of an individual, if it's close to a place where a tattoo with a name on it. And will there be any other type of data that could be accessed through the mobile phone? Where will the data be stored? Who has access to it? Do they have any form of governance framework? Right now, the kind of documents that we see are generally privacy policies that are written in a very contractual way in terms and agreements. But if there will be data sharing, especially with other researchers, what is the process and how is it presented to the participant, and what kind of mechanisms are in place? Also, what happens if the participant withdraws from the study, right? People have the right to withdraw at any time. How does that actually work with a mobile phone? If I've restarted my phone to default setting and I deleted the app, what happens? And there are so a lot of questions here. And of course, return of results also comes into play, especially in applications where they are asking people for pictures. Some of them are for study of melanoma. What happens if you do actually find a melanoma on an individual or something that's at risk of being one? This is not something that you just think of at the time where you see this or only in the consent form, but you need to have a policy in place to allow this to happen. And you have to also think about how you're going to be communicating this with the participants. A lot of times, some of the issues that are faced by a lot of research projects is the whole communication process. But now you have a tool to be able to do this with this, which is the mobile phone. And so, what kind of process do we have in place in order to, for us to be able to do this? It all comes back to trust, right? Trust in the system, trust in, the actual experience itself, but it also is a message for us to start thinking probably a little bit more holistically about governance and regulation. Right now, we're kind of really focused on governmental tools, regulation, for example, as medical devices, but we also have to think about the role of professional association, guidance, consumer protection, right? Because these are generally consumers that are using this, education, not only at the public level, but also at the professional level. In the future, are we going to find ourselves in a situation where people are going to come with their smartphones to their doctor and say, here's what's happening, what should I do, and how they need to deal with this? There is always questions about the validity of a lot of these tools, but they're going to be stronger and stronger, and they're probably going to require access to more personal information, such as electronic health records or genetic, databases. We've talked a lot about ELSI, the ethical, legal, and social issues. Psychology also needs to play a very important role in understanding a little bit our decision-making process as well. So all of these points are important to maintain that trust in the future. That's it from me. Thank you very much for your attention, and we're going to take the remaining time for questions from the audience. Thank you for your attention.
Brilliant, thank you, man. So there are two ways in which people can ask questions. You can either turn your screen on and ask the question directly yourself, or if you want to type a question in the chat, then I can read that out for you. So I actually wanted to have a question of my own that I wanted to put to you, man. And just really thinking, one of the things that struck me when you were talking in terms of, you know, governance and oversight is that it seems like a lot of these apps they're positioned in the health sphere, but they're deliberately putting in disclaimers and not positioning themselves in any way as medical tools or medical devices so that they can avoid that scrutiny which is there, you know, because once you put an extra level of regulation in, then there's a burden on developers to actually prove that what they're doing has some merit, has some quality. Do you think that that possible approaches to governance could include kind of expanding the definition of what counts as a medical device? Or do you actually think we need some other governance approaches? Do you think there's just other tools in the box that we could use, maybe, as you said, to do with consumer protection, things like that?
Yes. I think you know, expanding the definition might strain it a little bit. You know, especially with the increasingly big number of these applications out there and trying to classify them. You know, what falls under where, but also I think it's also a question of, do you have enough resources to be able to do this type of scrutiny? You know, because sometimes the approach is you self-declare. You say, I'm doing a medical, you know, device, and so I'm submitting my application for it, rather than we keep in check every app that, you know, is offered to our consumers and make a decision on them. I think that route might be a bit strained. I think there could be a little bit more of an expansion, but not too much. And I still think that it might not include the sheer big number of these applications, which is why I think we have to think about it from a different angle. Educating the public and educating physicians is going to be very important, because they're going to be able to understand what to look for in these applications. That's already a good tool out there. It will not, you know, I mean, there's a large variety, and many of them are very serious and well, you know, kind of prepared and developed apps out there, but some of them are not. But that will not completely, you know, kind of avoid anybody using maybe bad ones, but at least it gives them a tool that they can use. And then there are consumer protection aspects. Some of the discussions that are out there, there was a project that we were involved in, with an NIH funded project, and some of the ideas that came out of it was, well, this is maybe something that the companies themselves could play a very important role in, right? Because Apple did actually push for a change in the developers agreement to make sure that you know, anybody who's putting developers who are putting an app that requires research actually get the approval to do that. But then it could also be used in a way to inform the consumer about certain aspects. Now they've started doing that with privacy policies. So saying, for example, that this app does not have a privacy policy or has a privacy policy. This is great, but I think this was a push because of GDPR and all the, you know, but at the same time, you know, they can also categorize. They might not necessarily, if you're not able to know who's behind this no information, if it's not in the term, there's no terms of agreements, there's no privacy policy, they have the tools, for example, not to make them as the first choices that come out, or they can put some filters out there. The other option, which I think is going to be very important, that we are currently, for our project, struggling with, is that these app stores do not have a good search engine. because you just, it's endless, kind of scrolling, and you're like, when is this going to end? And it might not be at all pertinent to what you're looking for. So having these search engines, I think, will also, provide really good tools for people to be able to know. But consumer protection is also a field that needs to be, thought of a little bit more, especially here in Canada, as a tool for this. But again, there's so much going on at the moment. There are so many of those that are out there that it's an uphill battle. But I think it's still an important one, especially for keeping the context that we're, as some people say, living in a surveillance capitalism type of situation. I think it's important for us to know who's surveilling and what kind of information is being shared.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So I'm just looking to see if anyone has any questions. As I said, if you don't want to put your screen on, you can just type a question in the chat. While we're waiting for people, because sometimes people are furiously trying to think up their questions at the end of the talk and work out what one thing they really want to ask. Just as a follow-up question, and this might just be my kind of ignorance talking, but do we see any kind of market leaders emerging? Because I'm thinking in terms of industry self-regulation, if there's 1 million small app developers, there's maybe less impetus for someone to come in and set higher standards, because you would say, well, do we see any groups of kind of leading companies who might want to kind of have some sort of quality, the equivalent of a kite mark on their apps, to say they meet at least this minimum standard of quality? There's some basic privacy and data protection, there's some quality assurance there, or do we see just an incredibly fragmented landscape?
It's very fragmented, but there are some groups, especially in the United States, that are working with the large, kind of platforms to create open source, sort of templates for application that developers can use, and that includes a number of different important aspects related to consent, related to privacy, so that you don't have to start from scratch. But again, this is a very important step, and I think it's part of the education part. It's a very important step towards a solution, but alone it will not suffice, I think.
Thanks. So we do have a question in the chat from Miranda. So Miranda says, an interesting idea to put the onus on platforms hosting the apps instead of national regulators, as this is potentially such a lucrative space. Maybe there should be a form of verification for wellness fitness apps. Is that something
I think that's essentially what you were asking as well, Michael, when you mentioned kite marks. So I sort of slightly abandoned the question because I thought maybe I don't want to be repetitious. But no, I just thought it's very interesting, the idea that Apple or Google could, as they make so much money in this space, that they could bear the burden of policing this kite mark maybe before apps are made available. Any apps that maybe process large volumes of health data are made available on their stores. So I just wondered whether that idea has any legs.
Yeah, I mean, it's slowly but surely happening. As I mentioned, there has been some changes, but unfortunately, I think we also live in a time where sometimes we unfortunately need to wait for a scandal to hit before big changes happen. And I think this retroactive kind of or small scale but large impact kind of attitude is going to be very problematic. But I think it's also a question of, well, what kind of pressure is out there on them to be able to do this, and it's not a very fair situation. In that book that I mentioned to you, really interesting kind of anecdotes from people who created tools to keep people on the apps, including the one who developed, the endless scroll, as a way to keep you always hooked, right? And so basically, when he talked to designers, they would say, well, it's on you as in the consumer. You should just stop notifications and shut your phone. But he says, well, that's not very fair, because why should it be on me? I'm one person. It's true that I can stop notifications, but at the same time, other people that used to work with some of these apps and these companies say, well, it's one person trying to stop, but there is maybe 100 engineers trying to find ways to keep you on there. So it's not really a just or fair, situation. So it will probably take time, and I think we are more and more, sensitive to these questions. I think if you ask someone about algorithms or ask someone about data sharing 5 or 10 years ago, and you ask people now, they're probably much more aware of these. And I think this is moving in the right direction, but it will require a little bit more pressure.
Thanks. So so Miranda says that was a great answer. We do have another. It's more of a comment, I think, but it's from Josephine, who says there's a real issue of governmental commitment to regulation, safety and privacy versus the drive for political and economic drive for innovation. Do you see that's sort of part of the dynamic that's at play here?
Yeah, I think that sometimes this is some of the arguments that I hear as well. But I think at the same time, they don't necessarily need to be pitting each other, right? I think you can still strive for economic innovation, but at the same time reduce the surveillance aspect of it all. I think there is a way to make this, happen. So I don't necessarily see them as contradicting. I think sometimes they're presented that way, but at the same time, it's easy for a company to say, well, you're stifling me here. I'm not able to do what I'm supposed to do in advance. And they have a lot of lobbying power, of course. I think there is a way to use, do that and advance, while at the same time reducing the negative effects of this type of use.
Thanks. So I think, Josephine just put another message to say she agrees that it's absolutely not an either-or situation, but obviously it is an important part of the dynamic. So we have another question from Carmela, who says, how do you help the user distinguish good quality from wrong or misleading health information on the internet or on apps?
Yeah, we've also struggled with this, and I don't know if the question is really focused more on how these apps are different from you searching, let's say, on the internet for information. I don't see this as being very different from those two, because there is out there misinformation, and we've even seen in apps that there is actual disinformation based on ideological, aspect. So I don't see this as being totally different. The only thing that I would say is that sometimes when you search for something, you'll find information, but here there is an active process that's put in place that goes through filters, asks you questions. It really personalizes this for you, which makes it, more important to be sure that whatever information is out there is actually not erroneous, especially since people are using this as not as a complement to a doctor, but really using this so that they don't need to go see a doctor. But so that process itself is, I think, where the issue is that we're really personalizing this, and we're also asking for more and more personal data from you, which is not something that you would find, if you Google something and you look for information, because whatever they provide to you is going to be probably very generic and very large. But if you start asking questions, this is where it's going to be a little bit more personalized. But at the same time, again, I think it's really the education that's going to help a little bit in that. As in, well, you don't take this necessarily, take this with a grain of salt. If someone's sending you a messaging on your text saying, well, I've read this, well, look for the source, try to find, where it is. And if you don't understand it, well, find someone who does. But again, I think we're, again, in a society that does not necessarily always vet. There's the trust, but not necessarily the verify.
Okay. So do we have a question? Brilliant.
Yeah, thanks, man. First of all, for the interesting presentation. I was wondering, are there any mechanisms to ensure that vulnerable populations who are less able to make a consent, like children or psychiatric populations, to check for these populations and to make sure that they are protected well?
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the context. So in research, there's usually, the inclusion-exclusion criteria that play a very important role. And this, I think, is one way to vet this. But many of these applications as well have to do a lot of curation of their data. Because, and that is also something that's very costly for them, because, you don't necessarily have an idea who is at the other end. If they tell you that they're 25-year-old, but they're not 25-year-old, there are mechanisms in place to kind of clean the data. But in terms of protection, I think this is really when you design these platforms to engage with patient representatives and members of the public to ensure that there are aspects in there that are taken account of, and there are some security mechanisms that could be put in place. Sometimes it's just a question of making this available in many languages. Sometimes there are links or resources that are put to allow people to ask questions to experts so that they understand. Sometimes it's including representatives of certain population in the company or in the app or in the steering committee to ensure some sort of representativity when it comes to designing the tools, the consents, the access policies, and so on. But again, it's nascent, right? And this is a very important element that I think we will have to keep an eye on.
Right. Thanks.
Okay. Well, if I'll give people one last chance to ask a final question, but otherwise I'm aware that we are now at the end of time. So that seems like a good place to wrap things up, and just join me in thanking Man for a really great presentation and for patiently dealing with all our questions. So thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much, Man. Brilliant.
So, Sarah, if you would like to stop the recording.